Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Classical Academy Podcast, your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Phillips. My guest today is Zach Weichbrodt. He teaches medieval literature. He's on our senior thesis class. He oversees a lot of those guys and gals. He's also the chairman of Trinity's Humanities Department, dean of classical learning. And if that's not enough, every year he walks through hell. Yes, you want to send your kids to a school where the chairman walks through hell every year as he takes his students through Dante's Inferno. But tonight, he's back on the podcast to tell us of valiant warriors, mead halls, treasure hoards, legendary swords, and gory monsters from the Old English epic poem, Beowulf. Zach Weichbrodt, thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. I wish we were in a mead hall right now.
I do too. I think it would go a lot better and a lot longer probably. So let's get right to the question people want to know. You're talking about gory, swampy demons. Why study Beowulf?
So I'll give you three, and you can choose which one you like best. One of the first ones is Beowulf, as you mentioned in that introduction, is full of some of the ghostliest enemies and the goriest monsters, and frankly just darkness that's all around us in the form of monsters or of ancestral blood enemies, or the selfishness and pride and the vanity that can corrupt the human heart. So darkness is everywhere, and Beowulf is interested in asking, how do you keep the darkness out? Can anyone keep the darkness out? Another great reason to study Beowulf, and one of the reasons why we read it, is it also gives us someone who is literally a superhuman, somebody who can swim for days, grasping a blade, slaying whale beasts, somebody who can hold his breath underwater for hours upon hours, somebody who can throttle a monster with his bare hands, a superhuman, and wants to show us what a superhuman can teach the rest of us about being humans as mere humans. So after the superhuman teaches us, is there a third one, or were you combining those as the last group? So another great question that this text helps us with is, where do monsters come from? Some creatures have mythological backstories, or I'm sure Disney will invent a new backstory for whatever monster that you want to pick. But Beowulf is interested in not just showing where the creepy crawlies come from, but how is it that humans might become monsters, and we can make of ourselves something that threatens the existence of a community, or even can lead to the destruction and the downfall of a man.
So what's the context that we need to understand Beowulf? Just, a brief contextual overview, if you will.
So one of the great things about Beowulf is you can either have no context whatsoever and still get a lot out of it, or you can spend a long time digging deeply into all of the history and the myths and the legends. A few things that I think are particularly interesting about this particular text are, one, nobody really has any idea of when it was written. It could have been written in the mid-600s AD or the late 900s AD, which anytime you could be 350 years old or 0 years old is quite a mystery itself. But it was composed in England, and at that time frame, England was turning from a pagan culture and nation to an increasingly Christian nation, and that creates some fascinating questions for Beowulf. Is this a pagan story that Christians updated and rewrote? Is this Christians looking at a pagan past and trying to make sense of where they came from, and trying to see what this new story that they're trying to live their lives by, how it changes the old stories? So there's some mystery and ambiguity there that's pretty interesting to explore as we get into that world.
Wow. So in talking about the context, are we talking Vikings? Are we talking Danes? Are we talking Danish Vikings? And this is a poem. What kind of a poem is it?
Well, we're definitely talking about people with pretty dope-looking ships. So whether you're imagining like dragons and horns sculpted on the front or something else incredible, your imagination won't disappoint you when it comes to thinking about that. It's actually written in English about some Scandinavian happenings, and it's written in a very early form of Old English, which makes it one of the first books that we get to read at Trinity that is more directly within the American cultural, historical heritage heritage and background. And so every now and then we can actually look at the original and students can recognize some of the words or some of the phrases, or even with a little bit of coaching start to piece out some of the original words. So that's a fun exercise for us. And it's also written in a very unique poetic style. We can get a little bit of it because it comes from a language somewhat similar to what we currently read and talk about. But some of the poetic sensibilities are very different from what we're used to. If we imagine poems and epic stories written in English, we might imagine a lot of rhyming or a lot of fancy language. And Beowulf's not written quite like that. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of strong sounds and rhythms that come. You can imagine listening to someone over the fire at the mead hall reciting these stories and these legends, and maybe even singing them about their ancestors with a kind of rhythmic musicality that you might associate with a song, rather than maybe a poem that was meant to be read, rather than, as Beowulf is, sung, performed, and heard. One of the more fascinating aspects of that is the way that they use language. Beowulf is full of these things called kennings, which if you ever made fun of in elementary school on the playground, you might be unfortunately familiar with. But kennings are a feature where you take two different nouns and you join them together to rename something by its distinctive attributes. So if you were the kid with really thick glasses in first grade and got called Four Eyes, those kids are being more Anglo-Saxon and Norse than they realized, right? Taking two different nouns, joining them together and renaming something, or in this case, someone, by its key attributes. And the wonderful thing about that for Beowulf is they use those to tell us more than meets the eye about what things are. So one of the most common kennings that they'll use for a king, for instance, kings aren't just kings, kings are ring givers. That word instantly tells us that generosity and wealth are not just what it takes to be a good king, but a basic requirement of what it means to be a king. When the hero Beowulf is first introduced, one of his first actions is to try and negotiate his way into unknown territory and smooth talk his way past a coast guard who's there for the express purpose of screening armed strangers from foreign lands like him. And we're told that Beowulf unlocks his word hoard. So instead of just telling us that he spoke, we're told that Beowulf thinks about his words as something that are like treasures, meant to be hoarded, meant to be guarded, and only used judiciously, wisely, and for a good purpose. And so instead of just using poetry to make things sound prettier or more interesting, they also want to use their language to show us something about reality that we might not see otherwise.
Sure. Wow. So it almost seems to have a percussive feel to it, which of course fits the whole idea of the warrior and the drum sounding. You have this drumming percussive language that's carefully chosen by this hero, this brave hero. Let's give everybody an overview, some of the key points of Beowulf, so they kind of know what the story looks like.
Sure. So one of the first parts of the story introduces to us not a hero who will be known the seas wide across, but rather an upstart who lots of people aren't very sure about, who needs to prove himself, who maybe isn't quite as good as the heroes of old, or maybe isn't quite as good as the ancestors who came before him, who needs to prove himself. And of course, what better way to prove yourself than going across the sea and repaying an old family debt to help rid a foreign land of a monster that's been plaguing them for years upon years upon years. So when we first meet Beowulf, we meet him at this moment whenever he is not the hero that everyone who would have been in that audience knows and has heard sung of many times. So we really do get that origin story before somebody comes into his full glory, into his full maturity, and we get to track the progress and the growth of Beowulf from the upstart stripling into the glorious hero that he'll be by the story's end.
So who's the monster, and why was this demon enraged in the first place? Why was there a need for Beowulf to come back? And you said he was paying a family debt. What was that all about?
Okay, so We'll start with some 80s cartoon references. So this monster, whose name is Grendel, is afflicting the land of the Danes and the Danish king. And Beowulf has a special connection to that because his own father had to flee to the Danes whenever he got caught up in a blood feud that his own people thought was too dangerous and too risky with a rival nation. So they wanted nothing to do with him. He gets exiled and he has to find safe harbor with somebody willing to give him refuge and sanctuary. And it's the Danes. And so a generation after that, Beowulf comes to repay that debt of hospitality that his father enjoyed that eventually got him back in the good graces of his people, the Jouts that Beowulf comes from. And now he has the chance to do a good turn to the king who did so much to his father. And Hrothgar faces this incredible dilemma. He's a wise king, he's a just king, he's a prudent king, he's a generous king, he's a humble king. He's everything you could ever hope for. But you can be the greatest king and still not be able to save your people and to protect your people from anything that the world might throw at your way. So very much like a riff on the Grinch from How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Sure. The Danes are gathered together, they're celebrating, they're praising God, they're enjoying his blessings, and the sound of their music and the sound of their glad voices is reaching Grendel's grinchy little ears, and he can't stand the fact that these people are united together in joy and harmony. And so he decides to come to Hrothgar, the Danish king's hall, every night and eat up anyone who happens to be in his way. And he does this every night for 12 years, and this brave, just, wise king is ultimately at a complete loss. There's no strategy that can help the Danes. There's no prayer that is bringing salvation and rescue. There's no hero strong enough. There's no wall hardy enough to stand up to this. So he's at a complete loss, and it's in that moment that this stranger from abroad comes to repay that family debt.
Now, it's interesting because earlier you were talking about the possibility of a Christianized pagan version, or was it Christian, or is it purely pagan? And this has some kind of Christian themes to me of how of worship disturbing the demonic fighting back with this ferocity, and then a hero being sent to overcome these demonic powers. Is that ever discussed? Am I way off there, or is that my imagination, or is that something that we see here?
No, that's a wonderful question. That's really gets at one of the big tensions that occurs in the text, because as you can imagine, if the most dangerous place to be in the whole world is at the king's side, who's going to stand up and be faithful? Who's going to stand up and be loyal? Or who's going to shuffle off from the king's hall, the one place where every night a fire is burning, light is drawing people together, but that light makes them a target. And then the alternative is to scuttle off and hide in the darkness yourself, where maybe you'll be safe from the one big bad monster, but what are you going to become whenever you've turned your back on the one to whom you owe loyalty, when you forsake the light and turn to that darkness, trying to save yourself or seek some kind of shelter or safety? So that play of the light and the darkness, and how the darkness hates the light and is trying to overcome it and quench it. You've expressed it very well in biblical terms, and that's definitely one of the themes playing itself out in the story.
That's fantastic. So you see not only the idea of courage, virtue, faithfulness in the hero, but indeed in all the characters and the choices that are made of even the unnamed characters. Do they remain by the king's side? Do they remain by his side in the light as targets, or do they flee and, as you say, become their own little monsters? What a fantastic... I was going to say sidebar, but it's really a major theme of what's going on here.
It's absolutely major. So one of the ways that the story structures itself is Beowulf has to face off against a monster of the earth, a monster of the waters, and a monster of the sky. So there's your second 80s reference to Captain Planet. So we've got all these different monsters corresponding to the different elements in some way. And in order to prove himself as a true hero, Beowulf faces off against each of them. But one of the fascinating things about it is Beowulf, even though, as you said earlier, he often appears cocky, appears confident that he can do what no one else can do, he also carries with himself a very humble sense that the outcome of all of these fights is not in his control. And whether they be great kings or great warriors, those who are wise and presented as heroic in the story have this keen sense that you can give everything that you have, and you don't get to decide what the outcome is. Your strength, your intelligence, your cleverness aren't going to win the day. It's all ultimately up in the hands of God to decide what the outcome is. Mm-hmm. And so a hero isn't necessarily the one who wins the battle. It's the one who gives his all and understand who ultimately is going to tip those scales. And so that's another one of the fascinating developments in the story. If you can't guarantee an outcome by your virtue, by your heroism, will you still step up and will you still strive to meet the challenge even if you can't guarantee what's going to happen next?
Wow. It's quite inspiring, really. Well, we've kind of given an overview a little bit. You mentioned the three origins, or I should say the three elements of these monsters. So the first one, Grendel, is of the land. So then what happens? I mean, we've got Grendel's mama is pretty upset, right? So where does she play into this?
So as you might imagine, whenever you mess with a baby, you get the mama. And so after Beowulf defeats Grendel, and it's almost an anticlimactic, I won't spoil too much, but Grendel proves no match for Beowulf, this monster that's been more than a match for one of the greatest kingdoms and all of its brave warriors. And so Beowulf has to respond to the revenge wrought by Grendel's mother, who scurries back to this hellish, monstrous, swampy, bloody cave underneath the water. And it's fascinating because whenever her home gets introduced, it's in direct parallel to the king's hall that Beowulf has just met. You have two different rulers, the wise king above the earth and the infernal monster. She's called in another great kenning a hell dam, a mother of hell. And so she's there in her own little hall with her own underwater fire burning, with her treasures and her army and her supporters. But everything that made Hrothgar a good and worthy king, his justice, his generosity, she twists, she inverts, she turns to something else. And Beowulf has to swim down into the depths with a sword that has never before failed in any combat or any conquest. And I'll give you one guess as to what happens to this unfailing sword whenever it meets this greater demonic foe. And Beowulf is in the literal depths for the first time in his life, completely thrown because his plan has gone out the window. He has no help. He seemingly has no hope. And what's going to happen to him whenever everything that he brought to the table proves to not be enough? And the moment that he responds is one of the greatest moments in English literature and one of the best parts of any story that we get to read here at Trinity.
Well, if that doesn't make you, listener, want to pick up this poem and read it, nothing will, and it should. Now, the Satan in the Bible is referred to as a dragon. That's an interesting third foe for Beowulf, isn't it?
It absolutely. And this is also a unique enemy for Beowulf because 50 years pass from the time he faces down Grendel's mother to the time he has to face this final foe, the dragon. And we get to see Beowulf grow from just a daring warrior to a king. And there's different virtues, there's different qualities, there's different excellences that characterize a warrior fighting for someone else than a king who has to do more than just defeat all of his enemies. And there's some interesting questions that open up about how Beowulf transitions into this. He has no heir. He has no son to pass his kingdom on to. The dragon that he must face gets roused by a slave running away from a cruel master who happens upon the dragon's hoard and steals a golden treasure to try and bribe his way back into good graces. All is not well in the land. It's not altogether clear why things aren't well in the land. Is this a way that Beowulf maybe struggled to mature into a king? Or is this just another example of you can't foolproof your life? You cannot keep yourself from every danger, so what are you going to do whenever that inevitable darkness creeps back in? And certainly those demonic, satanic qualities of the dragon are very much in view as he not just spews fire, but inflicts maybe the greatest danger of hopelessness, of despair on the surrounding kingdom. And Beowulf himself, now 50 years after he was in kind of his flush of manhood and in his prime, has to wrestle and contend with that sense of despair and hopelessness here as he faces the final beast.
So Beowulf was mentored by the Danish king. I know it's a sorrowful goodbye when he returns to his own land. And so the question you're saying is, did the mentoring not take full effect, or was he as virtuous as this king who mentored him? And as you said, circumstances are just such that sometimes it turns out you're going to face a dragon that is a bit much. I mean, and that's part of the discussion of what's going on here. Now, they don't really take you chronologically through this mentoring. Does he reflects back on it as the story goes? How do we know a little bit about his mentoring into becoming a king?
One thing that surprises people sometimes when they read Beowulf is they're expecting just these long, sprawling, gory battles. And a great deal of the book is actually instead spent in just the kind of situation you're describing, where a king, where a kind of wise man or counselor spends pages giving wise advice, not just in moral proverbs, but drawing on the history of their people, drawing on their legends, drawing on their ancestors, and from those great stories, deriving these ideas and these principles and these morals about how to conduct yourself as a man or as a warrior or as a king. So we're privy to some of those. And again, the stage is always grandly set of gathered around the king's feast with the most sumptuous food and the most delicious drink and the greatest presents and the most moving music. And in all of these, amidst all of these, the king takes a moment to bend Beowulf's ear and tell him all of the hard-won wisdom that he has endured through to gain. And we get to lean in, as you imagine all the warriors on the benches are, to hear these gems be offered. And so we get to hear the advice, and we get little snippets of how he's put those into practice. But just as the hero's battles are meant to show us something about courage and about virtue, we also see some of the ideas that help fuel those heroic actions and the words that are being spoken, not just for the heroes, but for all the listeners, including us, to contemplate and reflect on and treasure and ultimately live by, to test and see if they'll bear good fruit in our lives.
So, wow, you Trinity parents, can you imagine, isn't it wonderful? Your student gets to have these discussions. So I want to ask Mr. Weichbrodt, what do you see? How do you see this affecting and forming, if you would? How do you see it forming the students?
I think that question that we started with, how do you keep the darkness out, is one that everyone wrestles with. And especially young people are wrestling with, whether it's learning how to face their own temptations that are coming from within, or whether they're dealing with new situations in their social lives or in the world around them for the first time. Maybe they're getting a job for the first time and they have to figure out how to stand up for themselves against some coworkers who are maybe treating them poorly, or a boss who's overly demanding, or what to do whenever you sleep late and you fail a responsibility. How do you step up in that situation? I think there's something about that sense that life is not going to be perfect. In fact, life is going to be full of all of these challenges, some that are 100% totally expected, and sometimes we trick ourselves into imagining that X won't lead to Y, and so it's a struggle and we get to that consequence. Or some things just completely come out of left field. No one could have foreseen that difficulty or that danger. And so to see these exemplars wrestling with all those different curveballs and the totally expected problems and moral questions of life is really fascinating, but also really formative for them, is to see how you deal with those. They won't face dragons, probably, or at least not in such an obvious form, but how will they deal with both the expected and the unexpected? And they have that exemplar and those examples to guide them from Beowulf.
So let's say I'm one of the parents. My student is studying Beowulf, hopefully with you, that I would be so fortunate. Is there a question or two that you think would be a great one for me to ask my student about Beowulf?
So two that come to mind, one maybe stemming from that last question. Beowulf is a hero who seems to be defined by these great moments and these big moments. And if you remember it all, being a young person, it's easy to define yourself or to define others by that one big moment, right? That big game or that embarrassing thing that happened or that one singular event. And not really pay attention to the moment by moment, day by day habits that we're building. And so that's a great question to ask. What defines you? How are you defined? Or whenever you have these spectacular successes or these debilitating failures, should that, how does that define who you are and what kind of person you are and how others see you and how you can affect that? So that's a great question to ask, is how does a person become defined, and what should you let define you, or what should you let define others? And Beowulf gives plenty of grist for that particular mill. And another question that stands out is also, how do men become their own worst enemies? Of all the different monsters that Beowulf has to face, some of the worst villains in the story are kings gone bad, warriors gone rogue. Not some mystical creature from the depths, but somebody who looked like you and walked like you and acted like you and shared the things that you share. And something went wrong and things continued to go wrong. And those often turn out to be the greatest scourges. So how is it that a man could become a monster, even one that's worse than a demon or a dragon? Because as much as Beowulf shows us those glittering heights of glory of the heroes, it also shows us some of the most dark depths of what humans can become when we get twisted and when we allow ourselves to give in to vice or to despair.
So listeners, there you go. Get your journal out, write down the question, how am I defined? Spend some time in Scripture, spend some time in prayer, then read Beowulf and answer the question again. How am I defined? Mr. Weichbrodt, this is fantastic. Zach, thank you so much for being with us. Beowulf just sounds so rich. I wish I could get a sub and come and sit under your teaching as you go through Beowulf. Parents, how blessed you are to have your students reading and studying this great text that is so much more than these battles against demons, but is certainly a search of defining oneself. So thank you so much for joining us on the Classical Academy podcast. It's presented by Trinity U, a service of Trinity Classical Academy, right here in Santa Clarita, California. Our producer is Shay Ramquist. Stephen Petrie is our audio engineer and provides our original music. Zach, again, thank you so much.
It's a joy. Thank you for having me.